Welcome back to Veil of Time, the channel where we explore untold histories, forgotten civilizations, and the impact of colonization, past, present, and future. Today, we're diving into a story often overlooked but too important to ignore: the Moors of North Africa. These remarkable people of Berber, Arab, and sub-Saharan African descent ruled vast parts of Spain, Portugal, and North Africa for centuries. But their influence didn't stop at political power. Oh no, the Moors were the hidden architects of Europe's architecture, science, philosophy, and culture. Yet somehow their contributions remain downplayed. Why? We'll get into that. Before we peel back the layers of history, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with others who love discovering the truths history books often leave out. And of course, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we uncover more of these untold stories. Before the Moors crossed into Europe, the continent was in the midst of what many historians refer to as the Dark Ages. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe struggled with political fragmentation, economic instability, and intellectual stagnation. Cities crumbled, trade routes became dangerous, and much of the ancient knowledge from the Greeks and Romans had been lost or forgotten. Life for the average European was tough. Agriculture was rudimentary. Most people lived in rural areas, and the once grand cities of the Roman era were now shadows of their former selves. Now let's shift to Spain in 711 AD. When the Moors arrived, they brought with them advanced agricultural practices, cutting-edge science, and architectural innovation. Under Moorish rule, Spain, known then as Al-Andalus, flourished in ways much of Europe could barely imagine at the time. Cities like Cordoba became beacons of learning, culture, and sophistication, while the rest of Europe remained largely isolated and decentralized. Before we go any further, let's clear up something important. Did the Moors actually call themselves Moors? Not exactly. The term Moors was largely a European designation used to describe the Muslim peoples of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. It didn't reflect any specific ethnicity or nationality. In fact, the word Moor was a catch-all term that came from the Greek word moros, which means dark or black. But the people we call Moors were a mix of Berbers, Arabs, and sub-Saharan Africans, united by their Islamic faith and cultural practices. They would have likely referred to themselves by their tribal or regional affiliations, such as Berbers from the Maghreb, or simply as Muslims. The label Moor was imposed by outsiders, which is important to understand when discussing their identity in a historical context. It's a reminder that history is often shaped by the names we are given rather than the ones we choose. While the term Moor may have stuck, the real story is far more nuanced. Who exactly were the Moors? Were they simply a shadow in the background of European history, or were they key players whose influence shaped a continent? Let's start at the beginning. The term Moors refers to the Muslim peoples of Berber, Arab, and sub-Saharan African descent, originally from North Africa. They weren't a monolithic group, but rather a diverse collection of tribes and cultures unified by Islam and the ambition to expand their territories. Of Europe was throwing old herbs at sick people and calling it medicine. The Moors were performing surgeries and writing comprehensive medical textbooks. But sure, let's keep calling it the Dark Ages. But here's the thing. When the Moors crossed into Spain in 711 AD, Islam was still a relatively new force. The religion had been established less than a century earlier, and the Berber Moors had only recently converted to Islam, so they weren't Muslim for generations before their conquest. This raises an interesting question. Did the Moors' knowledge and traditions come purely from Islamic influence, or did they bring their own indigenous wisdom into the Islamic fold? It's possible that the Moors blended their pre-Islamic knowledge, influenced by civilizations like the Carthaginians and, to a lesser degree, the Romans, with their newfound Islamic faith, creating a unique cultural synthesis. Before the spread of Islam, North Africa was under Roman control for centuries. The Roman Empire had a significant presence in the region, building cities, roads, and aqueducts that the Berber tribes, including the ancestors of the Moors, would have been exposed to. Roman culture, governance, and architecture left an enduring mark on North Africa, influencing the Berbers long before the arrival of Islam. The Roman way of organizing society, infrastructure, and even military tactics likely had some influence on how the Moors would later govern in Al-Andalus. But let's not forget that the Romans themselves were influenced by the Greeks. And the Greeks, well, they took much of their knowledge from the ancient Egyptians. While we can't say for certain, it's plausible that some remnants of this wisdom found their way to the Moors. Given the strong tradition of oral history in Africa, it's possible that traces of Egyptian knowledge survived, passed down through stories, practices, and customs. The Moors, inheritors of both African traditions and external influences, may have carried elements of ancient Egyptian wisdom, forming a cultural bridge that connected the knowledge of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Islam. Let's start with architecture. Ever heard of the Alhambra? If not, don't worry, we're here to fill in the gaps. The Alhambra, located in Granada, Spain, is a masterpiece of Moorish architecture. Built during the mid-13th century, its delicate mosaics, intricate arches, and stunning courtyards are some of the finest examples of Islamic art in the world. The Moors didn't just build with stone, they built with vision. They combined aesthetics with engineering to create structures that weren't just functional, but also expressions of their spiritual and philosophical beliefs. But here's the kicker. The Moors didn't stop at aesthetics. They introduced innovative techniques like the horseshoe arch and the macarnas, a form of ornamented vaulting. They also incorporated complex water systems into their designs, a technology centuries ahead of what the rest of Europe was doing at the time. Their architecture wasn't just beautiful, it was functional and sustainable, designed to coexist with the environment. You see, the Moors viewed architecture as an extension of their spirituality, a form of expressing harmony between human innovation and the natural world. It makes you wonder, how much of Europe's so-called Renaissance might never have happened without the foundation laid by these visionary architects? But it wasn't just architecture. The Moors were also pioneers in science, philosophy, and medicine. Cities like Cordoba, under Moorish rule, became centers of learning. Imagine a bustling metropolis with paved streets and streetlights. At a time when the rest of Europe was still in the dark, quite literally, Cordoba had libraries, hospitals, and universities that attracted scholars from across the known world. Let's talk about medicine for a moment. The Moors wrote medical encyclopedias that were used as textbooks for centuries across Europe. One of the most famous Moorish scholars, Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in the West, contributed extensively to the fields of philosophy and medicine. His works on Aristotle would eventually influence Western philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. Meanwhile, Moorish astronomers were charting the stars with precision instruments, and their agricultural innovations transformed the landscape of southern Europe. The Moors introduced crops like rice, citrus fruits, and cotton to the Iberian Peninsula, revolutionizing European agriculture. So just to clarify, while the rest... So what happens when you blend Arab, Berber, and sub-Saharan African influences with European culture? You get a melting pot of ideas, art, and intellectual achievements. The Moors not only preserved the works of ancient Greek and Roman scholars, but they also expanded upon them. Moorish Spain, or Al-Andalus, was a beacon of cultural exchange where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived, worked, and studied together. It was this harmonious blend that would later fuel Europe's intellectual revival, sparking the Renaissance. But again, I'm left wondering, why does history downplay this? Why is it that when we talk about the Renaissance, we rarely credit the Moors for being the intellectual bridge that carried Europe from the Dark Ages into the light? Of course, like all empires, the Moorish rule eventually came to an end. By the late 15th century, Christian kingdoms in Europe were on the rise, and the Reconquista, Spain's campaign to drive out the Moors, was in full force. In 1492, the same year Columbus set sail for the Americas, the last Moorish stronghold, Granada, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. And with that, nearly 800 years of Moorish influence came to a sudden end. But the Moors left behind more than buildings. Their influence shaped European science, culture, and society in ways that we are only just beginning to understand. And yet, in mainstream history, their contributions are often reduced to a footnote. Why? Perhaps it's easier to celebrate Europe's rise to power without acknowledging the diverse cultures that made that rise possible. Here's a question for you. What would Europe look like today if the Moors had never crossed into Spain? Would the Renaissance have ever happened? Would Europe have remained in the so-called Dark Ages a little longer? And more importantly, why is the narrative of non-European influence so often ignored or erased? In many ways, the Moors were the teachers of Europe, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. And yet, how quickly we forget our teachers, don't we? And that's where we'll leave it for today. The Moors of North Africa, so much more than conquerors, they were builders, scholars, and innovators whose legacy still echoes across Europe and beyond. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden chapters of history, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with anyone you know who loves exploring the untold side of the past. And hey, if you haven't already, subscribe to Veil of Time, where we uncover the stories that mainstream history often forgets. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think Europe would have looked like without the Moors' influence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, there's always more to discover beyond the veil. Until next time.